There's a version of this story where I explode, where I stand up, throw my napkin on the table, and tell my brother exactly what I do for a living, exactly what it costs me, exactly how many nights I've spent awake so people like him get to sleep. That version doesn't happen. What happens is quieter, and honestly, it's better. But to get there, you have to go back to that dinner table, because that's where it started, with my brother Derek, 34 years old, real estate broker, the kind of guy who measures a man's worth by the car he drives, holding up his phone to show the table a listing he'd just closed. Everyone clapped. My mother touched his arm like he'd cured something, and then Derek actually looked at me, for maybe the first time all night, and said the thing that thumbnail text is built around. "Must be nice," he said, smirking, "to just sit around all day playing soldier while the rest of us actually work. Real soldiers don't just sit around," he added, like he was quoting some bumper sticker he'd seen once. I said nothing. I want you to sit in that nothing with me for a second, because that's the whole story, right there, compressed into one silence. I didn't correct him. I didn't explain. I picked up my water glass and I drank, and I let the silence do what silence does at family dinners. It made everyone else uncomfortable instead of me, because I'd had 11 years of practice being uncomfortable, and this, compared to some of what I've lived through, was nothing. My phone was face down on the table beside my fork. It had been buzzing on and off for the last 20 minutes, and I hadn't looked at it, because you learn in my line of work that a buzzing phone at a family dinner is rarely urgent, and an urgent buzzing phone announces itself differently: 3 short vibrations, then a pause, then 3 more. Mine hadn't done that, yet. To understand how it came to this, a smug real estate agent going pale at a dinner table, a black SUV idling outside my mother's house 20 minutes later, you have to understand the two of us, Derek and me, and the 2 very different worlds we'd been living in since we were kids. Derek was always the one people noticed first. Golden hair, easy laugh, the kind of charm that gets you invited to things without ever having to ask. Growing up, he played quarterback for 2 seasons before he quit because the coach didn't get his vision. And my mother, Carol, framed the one newspaper clipping from his one good game like it was a diploma. I played chess and ran track and read books about Cold War intelligence operations under my blanket with a flashlight, and nobody framed anything of mine because nothing I did produced a photograph worth hanging. Derek got a business degree he barely finished and immediately started selling houses using our father's connections. I enlisted the week after graduation, and my mother cried, not with pride, with something closer to disappointment, like I'd chosen the discount version of a life she'd imagined for me. My father, Walter, wasn't cruel about it, not exactly. He just had a way of explaining away the gap between how he treated us that made it sound reasonable every single time. "Derek's just built different. He needs the encouragement. You've always been the strong one," he'd say, like strength was a resource that meant I required less of everything else, less attention, less curiosity, less of the basic warmth you'd extend to a stranger's kid, let alone your own. I stopped counting the number of times "you've always been the strong one" was used to excuse forgetting my graduation from basic training. I stopped counting a lot of things. That's a lie, actually. I never stopped counting. I just stopped saying the numbers out loud. The one person who never made me recite my accomplishments to earn a seat at the table was my grandmother, Ruth, my mother's mother, a woman who'd worked as a factory floor supervisor for 30 years and had 0 patience for people who mistook noise for substance. Ruth never once asked me to explain my job in terms she could brag about to her bridge club. She'd just squeeze my hand at Christmas and say, "You doing what needs doing?" And when I said yes, that was the whole conversation. She trusted the yes. Nobody else in my family had ever extended me that particular courtesy, belief without evidence, respect without a press release. By the time I was 28, I'd been selected for a role most of my extended family didn't know existed, in a unit whose name I still can't say out loud in a room with open windows. I can tell you I held a rank that outranked colonels twice my age in certain operational contexts. I can tell you my decisions, on more than one night I won't describe further, determined whether people came home to their families. What I can't tell you, what I couldn't tell Derek, or my mother, or anyone at that table, is almost everything else. That's the deal you make. You give up the right to be understood in exchange for work that actually matters, and most days I thought that trade was worth it. Most days. What made Derek's family dinner performances land the way they did wasn't just the smugness. It was that my parents let it happen, every time, like clockwork, like a ritual nobody questioned anymore. Derek would say something dismissive about government jobs or playing soldier, and my mother would laugh her light little laugh, the one that meant she agreed but didn't want to be caught agreeing, and my father would find something urgent to do with his napkin. Nobody defended me because, as far as they knew, there was nothing to defend, just a son who'd taken the safe, boring government route instead of building something, as my father liked to put it. I used to try to explain. I used to come home from something I couldn't name and try, in the vaguest possible language, to communicate the weight of it, and I'd watch their eyes glaze over within a sentence and a half, already halfway back to whatever Derek had going on with his latest listing. Somewhere around my 30th birthday, sitting in a debrief room 3,000 miles from that dinner table, still wearing the exhaustion of an operation I'd carried on my back for 6 straight days, I made a decision that had nothing dramatic about it in the moment. I decided I was done explaining. Not done loving them, that's a different, more complicated thing, but done performing my worth for an audience that had already decided the verdict before I opened my mouth. I stopped bringing it up. I stopped correcting Derek's little jabs. I let them believe whatever version of me was easiest to dismiss, because I'd finally understood something Ruth had probably known all along. You don't argue with people who've already made up their minds. You let the work speak, eventually, on its own schedule, in its own language. And if it never got the chance to speak at all, well, I told myself I could live with that too. I mostly believed it. What I didn't plan, what I never engineered, was the exact mechanism by which the truth would surface. I want to be honest about that, because there's a version of this story where I'm some mastermind orchestrating a big reveal at a dinner table for maximum theatrical effect, and that's not what happened. What happened is closer to the ordinary, unglamorous truth of how these things actually work. Protocols exist, chains of command exist, and sometimes they intersect with your personal life at the worst, most inconvenient, most perfectly timed moment imaginable. Here's what was actually happening while Derek was smirking over his water glass. 6 days earlier, I'd been read into an operational tasking that required rapid coordination across 3 time zones, and part of that coordination meant my location had to be tracked by my command element for the duration of the tasking window. Standard procedure. Nothing dramatic, just a box that gets checked when you're a commander whose signature authorizes things that can't wait for business hours. I'd told my ops chief where I'd be that evening, because that's protocol, not romance. You don't get to go dark during an active window just because it's your mother's birthday dinner. What I hadn't accounted for was the timing. The tasking accelerated. A verification requirement came in that couldn't wait, couldn't be routed around, couldn't be handled by anyone but the commander of record, which was me, sitting at a dinner table in my mother's dining room, half listening to my brother explain, again, how real soldiers don't just sit around. My phone had been buzzing with the early warning pings, the kind my team sends before an official contact, a courtesy so I'm not blindsided. I'd ignored 3 of them, because I'd made a rule for myself. Family dinner gets my full attention, unless it's the emergency cadence. Then it happened. 3 short vibrations. A pause. 3 more. The cadence that means now, not later. I picked up the phone, face down until that moment, and I turned it over to check it, not performing anything, not making a point, just doing my job the way I'd have done it in an empty room. The screen lit up with a notification banner from my secure messaging app, the one that doesn't hide the sender's title even in the preview, because operational speed matters more than my family's curiosity. Derek was sitting close enough to read it upside down. I watched his face do something I'd genuinely never seen it do before. The smirk didn't fall so much as it evaporated, all at once, like it had never really been anchored to anything solid in the first place. He read it twice, I think, before he said anything, and when he finally spoke, his voice had lost that easy, condescending music it usually carried. "What is that?" he said. Not a question, really, more like a man asking permission to not believe what he was looking at. The banner said what banners like that always say: short, procedural, addressed to a title, not a name, because titles are what matter in that system. Commander, Special Operations, authorization required. I didn't explain it to him. I didn't need to, not anymore, not after 11 years of not being asked. I just said, I need to take this, stood up, and stepped into the hallway, leaving my whole family staring at the space where I'd been sitting like I'd left a hole in the shape of a person they thought they understood. The call was short, clipped, exactly what you'd expect. Verification codes, a decision that needed my authorization within a fixed window, the kind of conversation that happens in a voice so flat and procedural it sounds almost boring if you don't know what's riding on it. I gave the authorization. I confirmed a secure extraction location. And because the tasking required in-person verification of a piece of equipment I'd need for the next phase, I gave them my location, my mother's house, the address I'd grown up memorizing before I ever memorized my own service number. I came back to the table and sat down like nothing had happened, because as far as the family dinner was concerned, nothing had, not yet. My mother asked if everything was all right, in that voice she uses when she wants the answer to be no, so she has something to manage. I said everything was fine. Derek didn't say anything else about real soldiers for the rest of the meal. I could feel him watching me the way you watch a door you're suddenly not sure is locked. 20 minutes later, the sound of tires on gravel pulled everyone's attention toward the front window, and my father, always the one who needs to know what's happening on his property, got up to look. I heard him say, quietly, in a voice that had gone strange and small, "There's a black SUV in the driveway, 2 of them, actually. Government plates." My mother's fork stopped halfway to her mouth. Derek's face had already gone somewhere past pale into something closer to gray. I stood up, wiped my mouth, and walked to the door before anyone else could get there, because I already knew who it was. My ops chief, Master Sergeant Alvarez, a man who does not do anything without precision, arriving exactly on schedule to hand verify the item my authorization had cleared for transport. He was in civilian clothes as protocol required for a residential pickup, but the moment I opened the door, he snapped to something that wasn't quite a salute, but was unmistakably deference, the kind of posture your body learns and never fully unlearns, even off the clock. "Commander," he said, loud enough, clear enough, that every single person standing frozen in that hallway behind me heard it land. "Sorry to interrupt your evening, ma'am. Verification's a 2-minute formality. Command didn't want to route around your authorization given the window." I heard my mother's breath catch behind me. I didn't turn around yet. I let it sit, the way I'd let Derek's comment sit an hour earlier, because some silences you build, and some silences you just have to let happen. Alvarez ran through the 2-minute formality exactly as promised, a signature, a code, a confirmation, and the entire time I could feel my family standing in that doorway like they were watching a movie they'd wandered into the middle of, trying to figure out who the main character actually was. Before he left, Alvarez did something he didn't have to do, something that wasn't in any protocol, something I think he did because he's known me for 6 years and he'd heard enough, over enough deployments, about the family that never asked. He turned to my father, still frozen by the door, and said, plainly, without performance, "You should be proud of her. Not many people carry what she carries." Then he got back in the SUV, and it pulled away down the same gravel driveway Derek and I had ridden bikes down as kids, and the silence it left behind was the loudest thing I'd heard in that house in 11 years. Derek didn't say anything for a long time. When he finally did, standing in the kitchen while our mother pretended to load a dishwasher that didn't need loading, his voice had none of its usual polish. "You're a commander," he said, like the word itself was something he had to test in his mouth before he could trust it. "Special operations." I told him yes, that's what I do, and that I hadn't lied to him. Exactly, I'd just let him believe the smaller version of me, because the smaller version was easier for everyone, including me, some nights. He asked how long. I said 11 years. He asked why I never told him. I looked at him for a second before I answered, and I let myself say the true thing, quietly, without any heat in it at all. I did tell you, you just weren't listening for it. My mother didn't say anything that night. My father found me later, out by the porch steps, and he stood there for a while before he managed, "I didn't know," in a voice that sounded older than I'd ever heard it. I told him that was the problem, not that he didn't know, but that he'd never once asked in a way that made it safe for me to answer. I want to tell you the ending is a wedding video, everyone crying, family restored kind of ending, but that's not the truth, and I promised myself a long time ago I'd stop performing things for an audience, even the audience reading this. What actually happened is smaller and, I think, more honest. Derek called me a few weeks later, awkward, stiff, clearly rehearsed, and said he was sorry, that he'd had no idea, that he'd talk to people differently from now on. I believed him, mostly. I told him thank you, and that I appreciated it, and I meant that too. But I didn't rush back into being the person who explains herself at every family gathering for the rest of my life, because that person spent 11 years being invisible, and I'm not in a hurry to resurrect her just because the visibility finally arrived on someone else's terms. These days, I spend most of my time around people who never once needed a black SUV to understand what I'm capable of, a team that read my file before they ever read my face, that trusted my judgment before they'd heard my voice raised even once. There's a specific kind of peace in being fully known by people who chose to know you, instead of half known by people who happened to be born into your life. My grandmother Ruth still asks the same question every time I see her, "You doing what needs doing?" And I still just say yes, and it's still the whole conversation, and it's still, somehow, the most respect I've ever been given at any dinner table in my life. My family checks in more now. Derek sends the occasional text, careful, a little formal, like he's still recalibrating who exactly he's talking to. I answer when I can. I don't perform gratitude I don't fully feel yet, and I don't pretend 11 years erase themselves because one dinner went sideways in my favor. Real soldiers don't just sit around, Derek said, and he wasn't wrong. Actually, he just didn't know, that night, exactly how much I'd already been carrying while he watched me sit there in silence. If any of this sounds familiar, if you've ever sat quiet through a room that underestimated you, waiting for the moment the truth arrived on its own schedule, I'd genuinely love to hear your story. Drop it in the comments. Sometimes the loudest reckonings start with someone who simply stopped explaining.